you can tell, my truck moves left or right, like that here. Okay. Go for mileage. You ready? Yeah, I did. I added 20. Because I can. Nothing else on there. Well, you seen I had to do a little work on that one. Nice member, customer, whatever you want to call them. Very reasonable to work with. And you notice, first thing I grabbed in doing a recovery, I grabbed straps. See, if a strap breaks, 90% of the time it won't do any damage. But when a strap isn't used, 90% of the time there will be damage. So it's just common sense. If you can get away with strapping stuff, straps. What got him hung up on that is he was fortunately going slow enough, it didn't do any damage. But what hung him up on it was it dropped down and the wheel was spinning, and it's got an open diff system. If you went too far to the right, the tire wouldn't climb back up. Nope. Nope. Part of my problem with doing this right now is these roads are not the greatest and they're sending me messages to get things done. Sick him out here having fun. Hey, look, there's a cat with white stripes. You think it was actually a cat, though? highways opened up a bit.